Okay, welcome. We are just going to get started in a moment with Dr. Christy Clark-Pujara, who is Chair and Professor of African American Studies at UW-Madison. Our thanks to National History Day and the Dr. Scholl Foundation for making this program possible. Oops, okay. So tonight with Dr. Clark-Pujara, we are going to be looking at Liberty for Who, Democracy and Race-Based Slavery in the Early American Republic. Lynn is not with us tonight. Lynn was just in Shanghai celebrating the return of NHD China. So I am going to be at the helm monitoring the Q&A box tonight. So if you could give me a bit more time to get back to you, I will certainly do my best to do that. If not within the webinar itself, then certainly I will follow up after. If I have the closed captioning on, and if that is something that you find distracting, go to the More button, ellipsis, and then Captions, and you should be able to turn off closed captions there. Okay, so if you have any questions over the course of the proceedings tonight in the webinar, as you know, use that Q&A box. I am monitoring it. Complete the survey at the end, which is required for your attendance. In the morning, as always, I will upload the recording, the slides, and resources. Oops. Module 4, our final module of Revolutionary Ideals. I don't know if you can hear that. That's my cat meowing in the background. My apologies. That will be available on Friday morning. And then the directions and the template for the final assessment for this course are already posted. You all have access to that. That's one of the final assignments, final things that you have to have complete for this course, and that's due on Monday, April 15th. So this is a fairly intense, messy looking slide. It's not meant to clearly share a lot of discrete information with you. It's just to emphasize that all of this information about the final assessment are available on your Google Classroom site. It is the top module, so you really can't miss it when you log on to Google Classroom and go to coursework. Excuse me. You'll see that I took a couple screenshots here, both from the assignment directions and a smaller screenshot from the template itself. That's the one in the bottom right that has blue text in it. This is a fully fillable Google Doc for you to use. So this is what you can use to create your assignment and to submit it to Google Classroom. A couple things that I want to emphasize is that this assignment asks you to integrate at least one primary source from the course and one active learning strategy. This is not a full curriculum that you are planning. This is a short 15 to 60-minute classroom exercise. Also know that these are going to be shared out to everyone. So we are creating a wealth of resources about teaching revolutionary ideals that will become a crowdsourced information gathering area of lessons that you all can use and adapt and implement in your own classrooms. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand things over to Dr. Clark-Pujara, who's going to lead us through the bulk of our time tonight.
You think after this many Zooms, I would remember to unmute. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining me after what I'm sure was a busy day at work. It was a busy one for me, I know. I'm Christy Clark-Pujara. Just to let you know, I do have an 8 and a 12-year-old. So if you see someone in the back, they're going up and down the stairs. So just to let you know that, so it doesn't be weird, like, who's that? I am a history professor at UW-Madison. I specialize in the early American Republic. I'm particularly interested in how the institution of slavery shaped society, politics, and the economy. I'm excited to be talking to you all this evening. History Day has a very special place in my heart. I did History Day when I was in junior high school, and I was the National History Day intern at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so I have some experience with History Day and I do some judging here. So always excited to be a part of any History Day activities. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do here is share my screen. Put it in slideshow mode. This bar out of my way. Okay, go. All right. Anytime I do American history, I start with a map of Turtle Island. So we can all just take a moment to remember that we are on indigenous land and that American history is just but a moment in time in the history of people in this place that we now call the United States of America. I am currently on Ho-Chunk land, on sacred Ho-Chunk land. I am in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm actually in a suburb of Madison, Wisconsin, but it's contiguous, it touches. And the neighborhood that I live in was a Ho-Chunk summer camp. So I just want you to think for a minute. Do you know what native land you're on? And if you don't know what native land you're on, why don't you? And after this webinar, I would hope that you will go and find out what native land that you are on. Because there is no American history without Indigenous history. I have a PhD in American history, and I was never required to take a single course in Indigenous history. And that was a deficit in my education, one that I have been trying to correct and address about really the last 6 or 7 years when I became really cognizant of how little I knew of Indigenous history and how that affected my ability to tell a full and complete story as I wrote books and articles. So I always start with a map of Turtle Island, as Indigenous people have called this place we now call North America for time immemorial. I want to begin with talking about two people that some of you may or may not know, William Lee and Ona Judge. You definitely know who their enslavers were. George Washington and Martha Washington, our first president and our first lady. Ona Judge was held by Martha Washington. She was her dower slave. And William Lee was held by George Washington. He was bought when he was a teenager. We know quite a bit about both William Lee and Ona Judge because of the records that were kept on George Washington and Martha Washington. But it isn't until really the 1990s that they become part of any of the master narrative, for lack of a better term, the traditional stories that are told about the founding of the United States. And it's not until the 21st century that we get a book about Ona Judge and articles about William Lee. And something that I always tell my students is, if you can only understand the American Revolution from the point of view of George Washington and Martha Washington, you don't understand America and you don't understand the American Revolution. What did the American Revolution look like from the vantage point of William Lee, of Ona Judge, who were held by the first family? What did freedom and liberty mean for 1/5 of the population that was held in race-based perpetual slavery? If that isn't a central question, anytime we talk about the American Revolution or the Revolutionary period, we are misunderstanding the American Revolution. You've probably seen pictures of William Lee. I'm actually going to go out right now and mute my computer to make sure you don't hear any random sounds. Sorry. Get back to the slideshow. Is the slideshow on? I just want to make sure that, because I went back and forth. Are we still good?
I see the slideshow, but it's in the big view or in the
Okay.
zoomed out view, not in the presenter view right now.
There it goes. Back to the presenter view. Okay,
Great.
sorry about that. So you've probably seen this picture of William Lee. Well, you've probably seen this picture, but sometimes William Lee is cut out. I'll show you the bigger picture later that I know you've seen with George Washington. And oftentimes William Lee is simply cropped out of the picture, which tells us something about what we know about American history, especially when it's taught very kind of traditionally and old school, like he's literally cut out of the story. Freedom, liberty, and slaves, the great American paradox. Edmund Morgan, one of my favorite historians, he's been the late Edmund Morgan, he was late when I was in grad school, made his career around a single question. How could the same individuals who developed such a dedication to liberty simultaneously maintain an institution that denied human liberty every hour of every day? I'm assuming everybody knows everyone in this picture. Thomas Jefferson. That's that picture of George Washington that often William Lee is cropped out of. And James Madison, the city of Madison that I'm in right now was named for James Madison, right? How could those authors of many of the texts that many Americans hold so dear, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, those who wrote so beautifully and eloquently and with such passion about liberty, also be enslavers? And what does that mean for us as Americans today and how we remember the founding of the American Republic and the American Revolution? It's also important to remember that it wasn't simply a war between the colonists and the British. It was a war between the colonists, the British, enslaved people, and indigenous people. We often teach the American Revolution and think about the American Revolutionary time as a conflict between American colonists and the British, but it was much more than that. Where do African Americans align themselves and why? What are the roles of the various indigenous people in the conflict that I won't talk about at all tonight because I simply don't have the time, right? So during the American Revolution, some 100,000 enslaved people self-liberated, ran away, became fugitives. That's a lot because there were about 500,000 enslaved people at the dawn of the American Revolution. And 100,000 run away. That number is also conservative because this is the number of folks that we know, right? It was reported, somebody wrote something down, mentioned it, said it. That's where that kind of number is coming from. So it's probably more than that. And then when we're thinking about the roles of both free and enslaved Black men and some women, right? They only checked to see if you had a trigger finger in the Revolutionary War itself. So why are so many people running away during the American Revolution? Well, slave patrols broke down. Why do slave patrols break down? Well, the same men that are serving in the slave patrol are now soldiers. So there's literally less men to serve on the slave patrols. And most colonies had requirements for adult white men to serve on the slave patrol for the protection of the colony, for the economic safety of the colony, because slave labor was central in many colonies. And so there were men that served on the slave patrol that could never hope to own another person, right? It was part of their duties as being a member of that colony. And during the American Revolution, there's a contest between, do you serve on the slave patrol? do you serve as a soldier, right? And so there's literally less men to go around. And as the slave patrols break down, enslaved people begin to run in droves. And for the first time, as many women run away as men, and in fact, entire families run. Right? And then you have those who are serving in the military. The vast majority of people of African descent serve in the British military. And the reason they do so is very practical. The British are the first to offer freedom in exchange for service. Right? The British are the first to offer freedom in exchange for service. And the vast majority of people of African descent live in the Southern colonies, where the Patriots are not going to extend the option of fighting for freedom, especially in places like the Carolinas, where Black people are the majority. That's the only colony in South Carolina. Most places they were 30% of the population or so, but way too many to offer freedom in exchange for service. They weren't going to arm that many Black men. Where you see patriots offer freedom in exchange for service is in the northern colonies, where enslaved people, people of African descent, make up less than 5% of the total population. Right? And they felt much safer in offering freedom in exchange for service. So that's why it's so lopsided, why so many African Americans are serving in the British ranks and not for patriots. And they're not fighting a war based on political alliance. Many of them are literally fighting for actual freedom. Now, you do have free African Americans that are fighting with the Patriots that were free before the American Revolution. And they are absolutely aligning themselves with a political cause. But the vast majority of African Americans that find themselves fighting in this conflict are literally fighting for their actual freedom, their freedom and the freedom of their families. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about our founding document. Actually, I'm going to spend more than a little bit of time. The Constitution. Because it's two things. It's both a freedom document and a pro-slavery document. It isn't either or, it's and, right? How do I know that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, a document that supported and protected the institution of race-based slavery? Well, I've just read it carefully, and anybody who's read it carefully knows this. It's a pro-slavery document as it is ratified in 1789, right? It's not really surprising that this is a pro-slavery document. 2/3 of the founding fathers held people in bondage. It's not shocking that politicians protected their own social, political, and economic interest. But there are explicit, specific protections for the institution of slavery in the founding document of our country. The first is the 3/5 clause, right? And this is about representation. It's about how folks are counted and what that means, right? So all the states are going to get the same number of senators, regardless of how many people live in that state. But the number of representatives is going to be proportional to the population of that state. So folks in California have a lot more representatives than folks in Wisconsin because there's a lot more people in California than Wisconsin, right? And so population matters in terms of how many, at that time, congressmen you would be allotted as a state, as well as the number of electors that you would get, which determines the presidency, right? And it is the large slave-holding states that hold out for this. Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, they are insisting on the 3/5 clause. And the 3/5 clause counts enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, right? As 3/5 of a person. I'm going to see if I can get exactly to the language, because I like to show you the language. And actually, before I do that, I want to talk about the other two things. That way I won't have to flip back and forth too much. The Fugitive Slave Clause. The Fugitive Slave Clause said that if you were enslaved anywhere, you were enslaved everywhere. So if you are an enslaved person and you run away from North Carolina and you run away to New Hampshire after New Hampshire has abolished slavery, the state of New Hampshire has a responsibility to return you to the state of North Carolina. Right? That if you owe service anywhere, you owe service everywhere. And then we have the 1808 slave trade law. And the 1808 slave trade law said that there could be no discussion of ending Americans' participation in the transatlantic slave trade until 1808. So it's a 20-year buffer, right? Can't even talk about it. Can't bring it up for discussion. Can't vote on it until 1808. You might think, why would they insist on this? Well, during the American Revolution, over 100,000 enslaved people run away. And in the language of the enslavers, they wanted to refill their coffers, right? And so they wanted to ensure unfettered access to the transatlantic slave trade. So this is where I'm just gonna stop the share and reshare because it usually works better that way. And we're gonna actually look at the language of the Constitution because the founders were not dumb men. And they did not want the word slavery and bondage in the founding document of the Republic. And so if you keyword search a PDF of the Constitution, you're not going to find slave or slavery or bondage. The institution is referred to, and I want you to know what I mean when I say that. So the 3/5 clause, as historians refer to it, is actually this clause. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole numbers of free persons, excluding those bound to service for a term, right? So those are indentured servants, and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons, right? So who's excluded? Indians not taxed. Who's included? Free persons, indentured persons, and 3/5 of all other persons. Who are all other persons? Enslaved people, right? So they're telling you the class of people and then saying everybody else. Who is everybody else? Slave people are everybody else, right? And so imagine the state of Virginia, 40% of the population is enslaved. That really matters in terms of how many people are in Virginia and what their proportion is going to be in terms of the number of congressmen that they're going to get and how many electors they're going to get. So it's referenced, right? It's not explicitly stated. You get the same for the fugitive slave law. It doesn't say, oh, if an enslaved person runs away to another state, that state has to return that enslaved person. Instead, it says, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. A fugitive slave clause, those who owe service. And then we have the slave trade clause. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, so people sold in the transatlantic slave trade, shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importations not exceeding $10 for each person. So regulating the slave trade, taxing it, protecting it, but never referencing the slave trade, the importation of such persons. Each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislator therefore may direct a number of electors equal to the whole numbers of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled to in Congress. So again, how many people are counted in the state is essential. This is why the census is mandated. It's a constitutional mandate every 10 years because it determines the number of Congress people and then the number of electors based on the number of senators and Congress people. So slavery is front and center in the very foundations of the American Republic. And you might have noticed, you might be asking yourself why there are these asterisks by all of these. And it's because that language that it was in brackets had been amended. And this is the thing about the American Constitution. This is the thing that I really love and admire about the Founding Fathers and the Constitution. They didn't think they knew everything. They created a document that could change with the people. So the very same document that supports and protects race-based slavery is going to become the document that destroys it. We have a living, breathing Constitution. We do not have to live with the mistakes of those who came before us. And the founders embraced that. That's why they had an amendment process. And right after the Constitution is ratified, what's the first thing they do? They amend it 10 times. We call it the Bill of Rights. Okay? All of the things that they missed. So we have a document that can change with the people. Right? We don't have to live in the wake of with the mistakes of those who came before us. But I always like to just share the actual language from the Constitution, because the words, like I said, slavery, bondage, you won't find them, but they clearly refer to the institution of slavery very clearly. I'll reshare and get back to the slides.
Just here to confirm that everything works.
Okay, thank you.
Looks good.
When we first get, when I say we, I'm talking about Americans at large, the past, right? When we start seeing race written into federal law, it's actually in our very first immigration law. That was largely authored by Thomas Jefferson. The 1790 naturalization law brings in the lexicon of racism into federal language. It limits the naturalization process to free white persons. And that's not overturned into 1952. And it's an extension of the protections of race-based slavery, right? Because the United States was founded not just as a republic, but a race-based slave-holding republic, right? Founded as a race-based slave-holding republic, which is why in our very first immigration law, we make clear who can become a citizen of the United States: free white persons. And it's not until 1952 that gets overturned, which is why you don't see permanent Asian immigration until after 1952. This is why you can do the Asian Exclusion Act and the Chinese Exclusion Acts, right? Because you have this law that says that naturalization is limited to white persons. The Constitution is also an incredible freedom document. It isn't just a pro-slavery document, it was both of them at the same time. It's sweeping and unprecedented protections for individual rights and personal liberty. It supports the rights of minority groups. And when I say minority groups in this context, I'm not referring to racial minorities. I'm referring to ethnic minorities like the Irish and the Scots and the Slavs and the Italians, and religious minorities like the Catholics and the Jews, right? And a reminder that our Constitution is messy on purpose, right? We get these three branches with equal power, and when they don't work together, things don't work. I often have to remind students that, in the 20th century, Republicans and Democrats sometimes agreed on things and actually passed legislation on a fairly regular basis, because many of them have never seen it in their lifetime. And then, of course, we have what I most appreciate about the Constitution is the amendment process. So how is it that those with such a dedication to liberty create a document that at its founding supports and protects race-based slavery in really explicit and critical ways? Edwin Morgan wrote a lot about this. And really what he concludes is they were able to so eloquently, and when I say they, I'm talking about the slaveholding founding fathers. They were so close to slavery that they had a special appreciation for freedom. And when I say close to slavery, I mean close to slavery. William Lee was George Washington's body servant. I often tell students, this is the guy that saw George Washington naked every day. He helped him bathe, he helped him dress, he took care of his wig, he salted it to keep it from molding, right? He's cleaning the wooden teeth. Slavery is intimate. It wasn't far away. He wasn't looking at people in a field occasionally. William Lee accompanied George Washington to every single military campaign he was on, to every Continental Congress. William Lee was there. The slaveholding founding fathers all had enslaved manservants. That was a hallmark of being an elite man in that period, to have a manservant. And the slaveholding ones, 2/3 of them, had enslaved men serving as their personal body servants. They couldn't forget about slavery. It was in their face every day, all the time, when they woke up, when they went to sleep. Thomas Jefferson didn't want to, and I quote, infect his people with thoughts of liberty, so he rented a man by the name of Richard Cupps from New England to serve as his body servant when he was at the Continental Congress. And he gets the nickname Richard Cupps because as Jefferson is penning the Declaration of Independence, he was drinking tea all the time, and Richard Cupps was literally in the room pouring tea. Yet when we look at pictures of the founding moment, we don't see enslaved people when they were literally in the room. We've written them out of that moment. And they've become separated from something they were so much a part of. They're literally in the room when these debates are happening. So the Constitution is a study in contrast. It is a document that protects race-based slavery, and it is a document that protects individual freedoms in ways that the Western world had never seen. It was both of those things at the same time. And it was written by folks that were dealing with that duality every day. So what happens? Two things happen after the American Revolution in terms of the institution of slavery. We see this slow decline of slavery in the North, this slow, kind of torturous decline. And when I say slow, Rhode Island abolished slavery in 1848. The state of New Jersey never abolishes slavery, so technically slavery exists in New Jersey until 1865. There were enslaved people in the North listed in the census in 1860. There weren't a lot of them. They were less than 1% of the population, but it existed, right? So slavery falls apart very slowly and unevenly in the North. And it devolves from a society with slaves to a mostly free society. What causes this dissolution is the actions of African Americans, both free and enslaved. There's just enough room in the North for African Americans to destroy the institution of slavery, to begin to destroy it. And it's because what's most important in the Northern economy was not the labor of slaves, but the business of slavery. What do I mean when I say the business of slavery? Where did more than 99% of all the slave ships leave from in North America? They didn't leave from ports in the South, they left from ports in the North. Where were those slave ships built? In New England. Where were they maintained? In New England. Where did they depart from? New England. Where did they come back to? New England, right? So you have New Englanders, Rhode Islanders in particular, in charge of the North American trade in slaves. So the business of slavery becomes central. And when I say that it's central to the economy, I'll give you the example of the place I know best, which is Rhode Island. I wrote my dissertation, first book, about the institution of slavery in Rhode Island. A slave ship in Rhode Island would have shackles that were locally made by a blacksmith. There would be rum on that slave ship. That's how people were bought in West Africa. And that rum would be distilled in Rhode Island. And it got distilled because there was a trade between New Englanders and slaveholders in places like Jamaica and Barbados and what becomes Haiti. And one of the things that they would do is they would trade firewood and food for cash and molasses. Molasses is what you need to distill rum. Rum becomes a currency in and of itself. It is the #1 export going out of New England. Right? So the business of slavery is central in the Northern economy, rather than the labor of enslaved people, who on a whole made up about 5% of the Northern population. Now, they were hyper concentrated. So in places like New York City, 25% of the population at times was enslaved, or Newport, Rhode Island, 20% of the population was enslaved. But if we look at the North as a whole, enslaved people, people of African descent, made up less than 5% of the population. So there's enough room in the North for African Americans to begin to successfully tear at the fabric of slavery. And what results from their running away, from their service in both the Patriot and Loyalist armies, and from their negotiations with enslavers, is this slow dissolution of slavery, and then it gets reflected in the law. So how legally does the institution of slavery fall apart in the North? It's through gradual emancipation laws, and I'll recite the one that I know the best. I'm checking my own watch and I need to hurry up. Children born to enslaved mothers before March 1st of 1784 will not be enslaved for life, but indentured to their mother's master until they reach their majority. So the gradual emancipation laws don't actually free anyone. They give a date at which someone will be free if they were born after a certain date. So if you were born a week before gradual emancipation law, you were enslaved for life. Unless you ran away, negotiated your freedom, bought your freedom, someone else bought your freedom. And so these are the first emancipation dates. But then some of these states also go on to abolish slavery, right? And so sometimes students will ask me, well, when did slavery end in the North? I go, well, where are you and when? Because it's different in New Hampshire to Rhode Island to Connecticut to New York, right? So it's this slow, uneven falling apart of slavery. By the time we get to 1820, the vast majority of Black people in the North are free, but you see slavery still persists. How does this happen? I got a little ahead of myself. African Americans press for freedom. Mum Bet's story is among my favorites, and it's because it's dramatic, but it also reminds us of the ingenuity of enslaved people. Mum Bet, who renames herself Elizabeth Freeman, was held by the Ashley family in Massachusetts. The Ashleys were among the most wealthy, powerful families in the state. And Colonel Ashley in his home is where the state constitution was first really hashed out. Like he would invite the leading men over and they would talk about what the state of Massachusetts would look like. Guess who was serving them tea and biscuits? Mumbet. She was listening to it all. And when she went out on errands, she was trying to find an abolitionist lawyer. She found one eventually and sued for her freedom and won. Now you have Black people who do this in almost every state. It only works in Massachusetts because there were a couple of abolitionists on the Massachusetts Supreme Court, on the state Supreme Court, right? And so enslaved people are tearing at the institution of slavery in all kinds of ways in the North, and it is slowly collapsing. But that freedom is circumscribed, right? You can be free and not have liberty. You can be free and not have liberty. African Americans were denied the right to vote in most states. They couldn't testify against whites in most states, or sit on juries, or stand in the militia. That was a big deal because that's how a lot of urban folks got their hands on a gun. There's social marginalization. There's segregated housing and transportation and public schools. We tend to think about racial segregation as being something that happens after the Civil War in the South. It begins its life in the United States in the North after the American Revolution. And you also have economic marginalization. And this functions a couple of ways. Some states required you to be white to have certain licenses, right? And so if you had been a skilled tradesman as an enslaved person, you can't practice that trade anymore. Or you can't get an apprentice in the trade that you want because they don't want to train Black folks. Right? And so you have marginalization that is not just political, it's social and it's economic. So you can be free and lacking in liberty. And again, I'll get students who ask me a question, well, when could Black men vote in the North? Well, it depends on when and where. And they're pushing back. So occasionally you'll have periods of time where Black men can vote. I'll give you an example. In Rhode Island, from 1789 to 1821, Black men who met the property qualification could vote. After 1822, they could not. They were allowed to vote again in 1848, right? So you get this back and forth, and it's because Black people are contesting their marginalization, right? But in most northern states, most of the time, most Black men cannot vote, testify against a white person in court, sit on juries, or muster in the militia, right? So they are free, but they do not have liberty. How do you push back against this circumscribed freedom? Well, they did lots of things. One of the things they did was name themselves, right? Mumbet changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman, like literally trying to distance themselves from slavery in a name. Sometimes they named themselves after people that we would think, why would you name yourself after? Like Washington and Jefferson. They were identifying with the ideals of the revolution, not the actions of the founding fathers, right? So are identifying with the ideals of the revolution. You might think, well, how do they know about the ideals of the revolution? Well, the term liberty in the air is a reference to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution literally being read aloud in town squares. And enslaved people, especially in the North, were often sit on errands. So they would have heard liberty in the air, literally. You do get a small Black middle and upper class that emerges, and they become very, very important because they pour their resources of both money and time and energy into the free Black community. And one thing that I've been really excited about the last couple of years, and if you get a chance, Google colored conventions, are these state and national conventions held by African Americans to address the abolition of slavery and the advocating of rights for free Black people. Historians, until about 10, 15 years ago, thought that these conventions were fairly rare. There were hundreds of them. And now there's a digital project to try to collect them all, because they were being looked at in isolation and not the aggregate. So it's just really exciting to see the political activity of free Black people in the early American Republic, and they are making such detailed, complex, and intricate arguments about why they should vote, why they should be allowed to vote, why they should be part of the electorate. And you can keyword search these things, and they're all freely available. If you just type in colored conventions, it'll show up. If you can't tell, it's one of my new favorite things to play around with and look through. This is a picture of the Free African Union Society house. Abraham Casey was one of those middle-class Black men in Newport, Rhode Island, and he was free before the American Revolution. And after the American Revolution, he opened his home to the creation of the Free African Union Society and Meeting House. And it's actually the first Black mutual aid society ever created in the United States. It eventually gets its own building. It eventually becomes the voice of the free Black community. And the Free African Union Society acts as a bank. It acts as a social place. It acts as a place of political activity. This house is on Division Street, which I found kind of funny. It was across the street from a slave trader in 1780. So I'm going to stop talking because I want people to have time for questions. But I think it's so important to really problematize how we think about the American Revolution. And I think a third leg of that is, what did the American Revolution mean for Indigenous people? That we should be asking that question as well. That if we limit ourselves and we limit what students learn to the founders, we fundamentally misunderstand the American Revolution. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark-Pujara. Immediately a key takeaway that I'm bringing with me from your talk is slavery is intimate. That feels really important. I will also say that I am recently aware of the Colored Conventions Project. Just to do a teaser, the theme book for 2025 will include an article on it that also links to the really wonderful resources that you were talking about. But please don't wait for June of this year to check out the Colored Conventions Project. The website is excellent. There are framing essays. I will share this resource with everyone, and I'm glad that you know about it, are using it, and that this resource, this idea, this topic is being more widely discussed and talked about. Okay, I'm going to move to share my screen. One moment. Can you confirm that you can see that?
Yes, I can see that.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do in just like the next couple of minutes, because I want to leave as many minutes of our time together as possible for Q&A, is to build from something that many of you positively reacted to from the last webinar, which was my 5 tips for teaching colonial American sources. So I, based on inspiration that I felt from the slides that Dr. Clark-Pujara shared that had data in them, I created a 5 tips for teaching with data. I'm not a data scientist. This is not my specialty as a historian. But I hope that just my practice as an instructor, a historian, that this is sort of like some of the basic tools, tips as teachers that you can take immediately into your classroom to think about, okay, Dr. Clark-Pujara was able to teach us with these charts of data. How could I also incorporate this into my own classroom? One of the other things with this is that Revolutionary Ideals, the lesson plan book that contains 50 different lessons by teachers for teachers, doesn't meaningfully engage with teaching with data. So in part, this is inspiration from the presentation that we just saw, but this is also addressing something that isn't contained in the lesson that you have available on our website. All right, so I'm going to go through these one by one. At the bottom of each of these 5 slides for the 5 different tips, I've included some prompts for classroom facilitation. And when using classroom facilitation, I mean that these might be things that you could consider as you are putting together a lesson, that you could consider for yourself so that you could do more research, you could prepare certain aspects of a lesson. Alternately, these could be questions that you pose to students themselves. So number 1 is to use data to facilitate discussion. It can be really intriguing, engaging, depending on students' learning styles, to feel really excited about seeing percentages, about seeing numbers, about seeing change over time as represented through numbers. Number 2, something that I think Dr. Clark-Pujara illustrated and demonstrated so beautifully in this webinar is the importance of contextualizing the data. So provide background information and context for the data. The key here is that I tried when I was creating this to emphasize the words why and how. But as you're contextualizing, help communicate to students why this is relevant and how it connects to the object of study that's larger. Number 3 is use multiple data sources. In addition to multiple data sources being able to provide a kind of layering of sources that builds a history and a narrative over the course of a lesson, over the course of an entire semester. It's also a way to engage different kinds of learners. Some students are visual learners and really love maps. Some might really feel drawn to the numbers. Some really might like looking at historical documents. But putting them in conversation with one another and demonstrating how historians engage with primary sources is a really effective way of using data and just a good practice in general. And certainly, again, something demonstrated so well in this webinar is using data to encourage critical thinking. So how do we help students think critically about a topic? And oftentimes when we're looking at a particular source, a particular primary source, something that we at NHD do that we try to really facilitate is the idea that we're not looking at bias. That bias, looking at a source and determining if it is biased, isn't always the most helpful way of thinking about a source. What's more helpful, we try to encourage, is how does this share a perspective? We don't really want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, thinking about different sources as being biased. Instead, let's expand the conversation, think about the source itself, how it was created, why it was created, and what kinds of perspectives we can get to by thinking critically. And finally, whenever you're able, and this might not be possible all the time, but provide real world examples. You all know that when students feel an affiliation with something, or they feel like something resonates in their own life, they often become a lot more excited about the topic at hand. So whenever you're able, ask them to think about how it applies to their life. Demonstrate for them how the data could apply to their life. So all of this information will be shared when I update things tomorrow. I hope that you find this helpful. Please give any feedback that you have. Now is the time of the evening where I remind you to complete the survey. So you can follow the link or use your phone to scan the QR code. Please complete the survey by next Tuesday for credit. Remember, this is how we know to give you credit for attending webinar number 3. I'll go back to that last slide, but I'll just say again, thanks to National History Day and to the Dr. Scholl Foundation for making Dr. Clark-Pujara's visit possible. So if you would like to go to the Q&A box, I will moderate any of the questions here and read them out as they come in.
Okay. Krista, can you go back to the slide that I showed with, it was like the population of free Black people?
Yes.
Because it made me, your explanation of the data made me think of something that's, I think, a really excellent example of that. So right here.
Okay.
So for a long time, the dissolution of slavery in the North was taught as that it happened as a result of the gradual emancipation laws. I told you that the gradual emancipation laws were a reflection, right, of what was happening. And the reason we know that is because of these numbers. So there's a historian, his name is John Woodsweet, and he wrote an article called, what was it, More Than Tears. Oh, it's gonna annoy me now. Yeah, More Than Tears, The Ordeal of Abolition in Revolutionary New England. And because he noticed something when he was looking at the numbers, he was like, a lot more people are free before they should have been, right? Like if it was just the gradual emancipation laws that led to the dissolution of slavery, a lot more people should have been held in bondage a lot longer. What else was happening, right? And where do we get these numbers from? The census. Why did the government care a lot about how many people were enslaved and how many people weren't enslaved? Same reason they care about things now, taxes, right? And so he was like, a lot more people are free before the gradual emancipation dates with free people. What's happening? And the article he wrote, More Than Tears, really made his career. He was like, we need to try to understand how so many people got free before the gradual emancipation laws would free them. So he went back to the archives and he started looking for emancipation documents and self-purchase. And when he started looking, he found them. He started looking for more runaway ads, right? Because it wasn't that the gradual emancipation law was getting rid of slavery in the North, it's that the gradual emancipation laws were reflecting what Black people were doing, which was destroying the institution of slavery. But if you don't look at the data closely, you can miss that.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Remember when
Thank
I
you so much.
learned that in grad school, it kind of blew my mind because I was like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, when you do start adding this up, because if you go to the slide right before this, you can see those gradual emancipation dates. Those are the first dates of freedom. There's no way that that many people should have been free that quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad that you were able to expand on that. Thank you.
So you want me to go to the Q&A box?
Yeah, I'll read out one of them here.
Okay.
I see a couple of questions, but the first one I see is, do you have any background in or anything to add about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787?
Oh, I do. So it's like that was a plan. I'm actually working on a book about slavery and I'm actually working on a book about slavery in the Midwest. I'm looking at the history of people of African descent and what becomes Wisconsin, which was part of the Northwest Ordinance. But the simple short of it is the ban on slavery from the 1887 Northwest Ordinance wasn't worth the paper it was written on. You have enslaved people being held in bondage in what becomes the Midwest until the 1840s. And I'll give you a specific example. Fort Crawford, which is in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, was a fort that was inherited from both the French and then the British, and then it becomes an American fort. And it was a site of slavery, especially with the Americans, because forts all over the Midwest were sites of slavery. Because one of the perks of being a military officer was that you got an allowance for a servant, or you got reimbursed for using your own enslaved person. Whose first officer's post was at Prairie du Chien, was at Fort Crawford in Prairie du Chien? Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy.
Wow.
Right? He brings enslaved people with him, and the government, the federal government, reimburses him for their use at Fort Crawford. Oh, and he was also supposed to be one of the officers that was regulating slavery in the territories. Wasn't worth the paper it was written on. The first territorial governor of Wisconsin, Henry Dodge, was a slaveholder. He brought 5 enslaved people with him from the state of Missouri: Joe, Toby, Lear, John, Joe, right? It's this unacknowledged history. And this stuff isn't really difficult to find. And you start looking at the papers of the founding fathers of the Midwest, of people like Henry Dodge, you'll see curious things like manumission papers that were signed by the county clerk's office in the territorial period. And it's like, slavery was functioning. Why was it functioning? Because who is mainly populating what becomes the American Midwest? It's New Englanders who are very familiar with slavery, people from New York and New Jersey as well, and people from the Upper South, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, right? It's statehood that stamps out slavery in the Midwest. In the territorial period, it was practiced. There's a great book on Illinois and slavery. It's called The Alchemy of Slavery by Scott Herman. It came out a couple of years ago, called The Alchemy of Slavery by Scott Herman. But it's a new and exciting field because for so long, historians didn't seriously think and investigate slavery in what becomes the Midwestern states because of the 1787 ban on slaveholding. There was no enforcement mechanism, and it wasn't enforced. So slavery persisted despite the law. Now, I want to be clear, slavery was sparse and irregular, but it did persist. Race-based slavery did persist in the Midwest through the 1840s. It was statehood that really stamped it out. That was a long answer.
That was an excellent answer. All right, so I have one more question here that's in the queue. If you have other questions, it's 7:01 now. I understand if life takes you away, please fill out the survey. But I'm going to pose this question here to Dr. Clark-Pujara. A participant says this is a truly impossible question to answer, but they're going to ask it anyway. And I think this has something to do with the teaching tips of how to use data and thinking about wanting to connect things to the present, but getting students to really care about the content being shared, the different skills that are being shared. Dr. Clark-Pujara, do you have any insight that you can share about really getting student attention?
Tell them a story. Make them care about the people you're talking about. Erica Armstrong Dunbar's Never Caught is a book that my students love. They're like, it reads like a novel. I used to teach it over 2 weeks, but they were reading it in one. There's also a children's version of it that is great for, I'd say, 5th grade through 8th grade. And kids connect with her. So you have to make them care about a person, because it's not just the abstract. It's not a stick figure of a person that's enslaved. It's, her name is Ona Judge, and I know what she looks like, and I know her parents are, and I know how she feels because we have her interviews and she told us. You have to get it away from the abstract and talk about people. Whenever I talk about the American Revolution, I start with talking about people. Who was William Lee? He was sold away from his brother that he was really close to when he was 18 years old, and he's following George Washington all over the place. And, you know, he's sleeping on the floors of the best hotels right next to, like, tell them who these people are. Tell them that Ona Judge is most likely related to Martha Washington, because Ona Judge is the daughter of probably Martha's half-sister. Tell them they're people, right? It's not the abstract. And I never start with numbers. I always start with a story of a person. I do this when I talk about the transatlantic slave trade. I tell them someone's name, who they were in their village, and then I start talking about it, because you have to remind them that we're not talking in the abstract. We're not just dealing with, these are people, and they had folks that they loved and folks that they hated, and they were a whole person just like you. And as many different personalities that exist in a classroom, that's as many different personalities that existed on a plantation or in a household, and people responded differently. Because that's what I find so fascinating about slavery. It's never the same story, because the people are never the same. The enslavers aren't the same, and the enslaved aren't the same, because they're individual people. So I think when you Start with a story of a person. Then students care more because it's not just a group. It's not the slaves. Right? It's on the judge. It's William. It's Richard Cups. Who are they?
That's really important advice. And I'm reminded of Rebecca Hall's book, Wake. It's a graphic novel. I've had great success teaching with that in dual enrollment courses, so upper level high school students. And what she's able to demonstrate so effectively is even when you don't have a full account of who people were and the floors that they slept on and the cups of tea that they poured, that there still is a possibility of utilizing tools like historical imagination to restore humanity.
And think about who they were and the situations they were in.
Yeah. Okay, we have another question. So in addition to the ideas that you've mentioned, Dr. Clark-Pujara, what other trends in historiography do you see related to tonight's theme?
I think it's really important to further problematize the founders. And what I mean by that is oftentimes you'll see this in political rhetoric where people will go, well, the founders said this, and most of those people, the founders wouldn't have wanted to vote. I think people really forget how elitist they were and that we need to remind our students of that and then explain that elitism. So like I always like whatever's I usually pick a state in the Northeast, like New York or New Jersey, and I figure out their property qualification and then use an inflation calculator and then ask my students like how many of their families, because if your family still has a mortgage, you don't count, would have been able to vote. And it's a reminder to students that in 1790, most white men couldn't vote, right? Like we tend to want to make it simple and think about it in terms of race or sex, but we need to add in class, right? This changes radically. By the time we get to 1840, most white men can vote, but in 1790, most cannot. And why? What is the rationale for that? The founders say that, somebody who, is dependent on a wage or living on somebody else's land is dependent and can be, coerced into voting different kind of ways, and really get them thinking about the context of the situation. Because you'll hear people spouting off, well, the founders said this. If the founders came back tomorrow, they wouldn't think people like you should vote for the most part because you're too regular, right? Like that they were elite, but explain their elitism, right? And so that they understand that these people are just as complicated as we are, that it wasn't simple back then, and now things are complex. Things have always been complex. And I also think that that's another way of drawing students in, right? Like painting the past as, quaint and simple is boring and untrue. It wasn't simple and it wasn't quaint. It was just as complicated and complex and contrasting as our society is now, just in different ways. And really getting them to understand that. But I think adding a class component is critical.
That concludes all of the questions that folks have posed. I do want to say or comment on the sheer number of resources that people shared in the chat during the webinar today and also during the Q&A. I have kept copious notes of the resources shared and also the resources that Dr. Clark-Pujara mentioned, and I will be adding all of those to our ongoing list of resources. So you will see that reflected tonight or tomorrow morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark-Pujara.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for coming out after a long day at work. Yeah, for all of us, right? Let me just make sure. Just some notes of thanks. Thank you. Thanks for an amazing lecture. Oh, you're very welcome. Happy to do it.
Yes. All right. So with that, I am going to end the show and I am going to turn off the recording.